Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Spence, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics and author of the book, The Next Convergence. Michael, many thanks for being with us today. We appreciate you taking time to be with us here at IMD.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So let's start at the beginning. What do you mean by the next convergence?
Well, if you look at economic history and go back before the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the 18th century, what you find is that A, there wasn't much growth, and B, most countries were rather similar. There was a powerful, relatively rich elite, and pretty much everybody by our standards was poor. And that pattern broke completely in the British Industrial Revolution. There's thousands of books written about that. But that process of incomes rising and so on started in Britain. There, of course, there's a technological element to this as the driving force. And it spread to continental Europe and fairly quickly, and then across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States, and eventually another jump to Australia and New Zealand. But there it stopped. And then that elevated growth, which is unusual in the history of the world, went on for 200 years. And roughly 15 to 20% of the people in the world were affected by it, and the other 80 to 85% weren't. They were in colonial empires or sort of disconnected somehow. And that took us all the way through World War II. And what this book is about is that pattern changed again. And though it was impossible to see it at the time, Paul, what was really happening is that for about three basic reasons, the rest of the world kind of joined the party. And now we're sort of really seeing it midway through this century that I characterized as the next convergence.
So what were those reasons that the other countries joined the party? We've seen extraordinary growth rates in the developing countries. What have been the key drivers behind that?
Well, you know, the motivation was fairly simple. The leaders in the developed countries after World War II made up their mind, I think, with huge effect, not to repeat the mistakes after World War I, not to crush the vanquished, to open the global economy, to avoid all the things that we saw, you know, hyperinflation in Germany, the Nazi Party rise, all kinds of things went wrong. So they opened the global economy. At the same moment, for reasons that overlap with it, the colonial empires all sort of fell apart. So the built-in asymmetries, you know, embedded in a colonial structure, you know, where the kind of colonial powers used these entities for certain purposes, but there was really an asymmetric relationship. That all went away. And then they opened the global economy, and these are accidents of history, the technology, you know, transportation, communication, and so on, you know, brought the world in, you know, together, making it a smaller place. And the combination of all of those things, good policy, well-intentioned, the opening up that went with it, the technology, and the collapse of those colonial structures, and there was just a new opportunity set. The reason it didn't happen instantly is it's pretty hard to grow at those speeds, and if you're in a low-growth equilibrium, it's pretty hard to sort of jump and get into a high-growth one. So there were different starting points. It would go Japan and Brazil initially, spreading to the Asian tigers, spreading in much of Asia, with some other examples scattered around the globe. But the main event now, of course, is the acceleration of China first and then India following. These are the future economic giants of the global economy.
So today China and India together represent 8-9% of total GDP. How do you expect that to evolve in the next decade? What do you see that playing out as?
Well, let's take China first. China's roughly 4 times the size of India. That's 2 doublings, right? But don't forget, you know, if you're growing at 10%, you double in 7 years. So in a decade and a half, India will be where China is now. It may not be quite that fast, but you get the idea. Everything gets compressed at these growth rates. And in the developed countries, we don't experience growth, never have. Even when we were growing, you know, we experienced growth rates of 2, 3, maybe 4%. So it's a different world. So China's the second largest economy in the world, just having passed Japan. It's a little bit less than half the size of the United States or Europe, taken together. They're similar. Europe's a bit bigger. In about 10 years, China will be the biggest economy in the world, but remember, it has 4 times as many people as, say, the United States. So it'll still be not a high-income country. It'll be making progress. And India will be proceeding, as I say, along about, 15 years kind of behind. But so if you look out over a slightly longer time horizon, and nothing disrupts this process, either mistakes or, some kind of reversal in the openness of the global economy. It could be natural resources in the environment, just pressure on the limited resources that we have on this planet where we live together. Then these countries will steadily, first they'll become bigger than everybody else, and then they'll go up the income spectrum, and at some point they'll be a very important part of the governance of the global economy, and they're going to have to learn how to discharge that responsibility effectively.
And the global economy is set to more or less triple in the next 25 years. You touched there on natural resources. It would seem that the natural resources of this planet are just not set up to deal with that kind of growth. How is that going to be addressed?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't think any of us actually knows the answer, so I think what I can do is maybe frame it a little bit. There's lots of natural resources, right? There's water, there's energy of a variety of kinds, there's alternative energies, there's environmental issues, of which probably the largest and most visible is climate change, or the potential of climate change. And so let me cut through it this way. When you get big countries like China is now and India will be, and they look forward, they don't ask themselves, can we as a planet, finish this growth path? They ask, in addition, can we as a country finish this growth path? Because they are capable, they will generate a fair amount of this growth in absolute terms. And so what I think is happening in Asia, East and South and broadly, where 60% of the world's population lives, they know that's where most of the growth is going to occur, and they've pretty much reached the conclusion that if they try to do that on the old growth model, meaning the old ways of consuming energy, constructing cities, and all of that, the stuff that we're used to, that it won't work at scale. It just doesn't scale that high. So that means we're going to set off on a course, and this is where, natural resources and environmental things like climate change overlap, in which basically, probably with them taking a pretty important leadership role, they're going to try to economize on energy, reduce the energy intensity, is the term that's normally used, of their growth path, and they're going to try to invent a somewhat modified growth model that enables this transition. In the course of doing that, they will have big external effects. Growth, negative, right? These countries are capable of driving up the price of energy, just by virtue of their own growth. So the economizing on this will produce ways of living, technologies, and so on that may be adopted elsewhere, so that we're actually all on a different growth path. And of course, others will be doing things. Europe has been, I think, in a leadership position and taking these things seriously for some time now. It's hard to know when North America will sort of get on board. Canada and the United States, they're pretty low on energy efficiency and high on carbon emissions right now. On the other hand, people's values are changing. There's lots of local initiatives. This doesn't all get done either internationally or at the level of central government. So I think it's easy to talk oneself into being pessimistic about that side of the Atlantic, but I think it probably isn't as bad as it sometimes looks from this side. Bottom line is, we're going to have to figure out a way to lower and increase energy efficiency without damaging lifestyles too much. And eventually, then, we're also going to have to switch over to lower carbon. If I read the expert work properly, I think in terms of absolute constraints, the climate change comes before the energy. There's actually a ton of energy out there. The problem is a lot of it has carbon implications. If you set the time horizon the end of this century, 90 years from now, we're probably not going to run out of energy on that time scale, but we may run into significant changes in average temperatures.
So innovation is going to be important, technology is going to be important, but you touched as well there on leadership. What is the role of governance in this? That surely has to be one of the major levers to pull in the years to come.
Yeah, I think that's right. When going back to the developing countries, if you're sitting there in this low-level equilibrium and you ask, well, what is it that sort of happens, when you get started? Usually it appears, although it's hard to prove this scientifically, there's some important contribution from leadership. And what leadership, I think, does is, one, create a vision, so people understand kind of all together that it doesn't have to be this way. It can, we can actually make progress. Then there's some consensus building. There's a way to do this where, kind of everybody benefits to a first approximation. There's some strategy choices that are pretty important. So leadership's key in that. And I think if we're going to propagate a different vision and different values and so on, that are the kind of deep underpinning of a different way of thinking about economic progress and whatnot, then it's going to have to come from leadership. Now, the leadership, in this world of social media and whatnot, may be a pretty decentralized operation, and we may have leaders popping up, among the young from all over the place, which is great. But I think the concept is still valid.
Are we going to see new leadership models?
Well, I think we have to. I certainly at my age wouldn't presume, to understand all the implications of this new technology, but you can form groups now, at very low cost based on almost any common set of interests or anything else for that matter. I would think this will affect political processes, social processes, democratic structures and so on, and profoundly. How it'll come all out, it's kind of hard to tell at this stage, but you can see the effects are already huge.
So we've talked a lot about what's going to be happening in the developing countries. If we think today of what we might call the advanced countries, the impact of the global crisis has been slow growth or no growth, in some cases negative growth, huge accumulation of debt. Can we expect that to remain for a significant period? Is that the outcome of the global crisis that we're doomed to accept for a few years to come?
Well, it'll certainly continue for a while. Nobody knows how long. I try to explain that this crisis that we had was a combination of two things. It was a big blow, and we have to recover from it. That's basically deleveraging of a variety of kinds, which isn't normally a good thing for growth, regardless of where it occurs. It could be a government, it could be the household sector, as is what's happening in the United States. But the crisis was also, in part, the result of unbalanced growth paths coming in. So if you start to think this way, and I admit that thinking this way comes from the developing countryside, because structural change is such an important part of that growth process. You can't really avoid thinking about it. But if you look at America and much of Europe, you had a pattern of excess consumption driving growth on the demand side. The pattern differed across countries. In America, to some extent in the United Kingdom and in Spain, you had debt-fueled asset bubbles that made people feel wealthier for a while, and they consumed more, and then that came to a sudden stop. In Europe, in the south, where I live, in Italy, some of the governments just levered up and, kind of skipped the intermediate step and drove the public sector consumption side up. And the result of that is economies that have what you might think of as delayed structural adjustment. So in America, for example, we had next to negligible job growth in the tradable side of the economy. But, government grew, healthcare grew, domestic consumption was high. There wasn't an unemployment problem, so we just went on our merry way. This went on for a couple of decades. And then all of a sudden, we've got to change the path. If, with different histories, you would have had structural change coming from both market forces and policy much earlier. And so the answer to your question is, what can we expect? We can expect the deleveraging process, but we can also expect the effect of delayed structural adjustment in a lot of economies. So in Italy, you have a reform process that isn't complete, but looks like it's at least getting started under the new government. It's focused not only on fiscal consolidation, but on restoring growth momentum, and it'll have structural features to it. I think the same thing will happen in America, although, if you look at the political dialogue now, you wouldn't want to bet a lot on it in the short run. But so that's the kind of thing. We're doing two things at the same time. We're sort of adapting our structures to make them a more sustainable pattern of growth and employment generation, and at the same time we're delevering and recovering from a fairly major distortion emanating from, at least in part, from the financial side.
A lot of those are very salient examples of short-term thinking and national thinking. Mm-hmm. Are we moving towards, or do we need to move towards more long-term thinking, more inclusiveness, more global thinking? Are those the imperatives for countries moving forward?
Yeah, I do. I think that's exactly right. I think the policy agenda varies from country to country, so it's very difficult to make generalizations. I think the Germans, who had basically a major competitive employment and productivity problem around the year 2000, for understandable reasons. I mean, they'd united with East Germany, which was a much different economy after many decades of the Cold War. Anyway, they knew they had to go after it, and they did. The solutions may not be perfect, but it's really quite a different economy, more flexible labor markets, rebuilt social protection systems and social safety nets, commitment to employment, as opposed to particular locations and functions, a healthy advanced manufacturing sector. If you go back and say, well, what was this about? The answer was, well, if you think of your economy all by itself, it really doesn't matter what your relative productivity is. But they realized they couldn't do that. Big economy like the United States has been used to being big, relatively dominant, somewhat less open by the conventional measures. I don't mean not open, but when you have an economy that size, you tend to sell a lot of stuff to it as opposed to outside. I think this transition to thinking of itself as dependent in terms of performance on what else is going on in the global economy has been somewhat delayed. So you tend to see better adaptation in the ones where it's been effective in small, relatively open economies like Sweden, like the Netherlands, and so on, because they've been wrestling with this for a long time. I mean, you can't have an efficient closed economy that isn't highly specialized when you're that small. So probably the biggest kind of change of mindset that's coming is the one that's going to happen in America. The rest of the world matters. You have to look out and anticipate these structural changes. They're pretty big. They're not cyclical. They're secular. If the global economy goes from, say, 20% in developed countries to 85% on a 100-year time horizon, that's only going to happen once. And we seem to be at the inflection point where the developing countries, the emerging economies, as they're sometimes called, are about to pass 50% of the global economy. They're big enough to have real impacts on us. So yes, I think we're going to have longer time horizons. We'll have to have a component of policy that's focused on longer term issues. And I think to the extent that countries have thought that policy should be mainly about supporting the market system, that's right. Correcting market failures like externalities or informational problems, that's right. But a policy agenda that's focused on, well, think of it this way. Markets are pretty good at efficiency, properly supported, at efficiency, growth, innovation, that kind of thing. It seems pretty clear that we now have issues having to do with stability, equity, and sustainability, where it's not clear that left to their own devices, markets are doing a great job. So I think we have, in multiple dimensions, a big challenge of changing our mindsets, but even in the academic world, to understand the stability characteristics or lack thereof of some of these very complex things that we operate with day to day, like the financial system. So there's research opportunities that are needed to underpin this effort as well.
So if we bring this to almost to a microcosm in some sense, you mentioned before that you're based in Italy. If we look at what's happening in Europe now, I guess to a certain extent this is a great test ground for some of the issues that we've been talking about, where we see a mixture of national will, European will, political will, or lack of political will. How do you see that evolving? Italy's kind of in almost the center of the storm there. What do you see happening?
Well, I'm somewhat optimistic. I mean, I admit, if you think of this as an investor, right, you could make a pretty negative case. I mean, institutional investors pretty much everywhere are dialing back the guidelines on European sovereign debt, except for Germany and a few Nordic countries. So, you know, but the reason I'm optimistic is, one, people are serious about the European enterprise. It's been underway for 60 years now, and it matters. And I think it has a lot of commitment. Second, Italy looked like it was lost there for a while. I mean, we would describe the political process as distracted. But we have a technical government now, top flight leader in Mario Monti, doesn't, as far as I know, have a political, you know, sort of set of ambitions. So his job, I think he thinks, is to get this done and put the country on a new track. And that job he's tackling apparently with some political support. It is crucial. I mean, Italy's sovereign debt market is the third largest in the world. So while my personal opinion is that Greece and possibly Portugal will find it, in the end, is sort of in their interest to exit somehow from the Eurozone in order to have any potential growth at all. And growth may not appeal to people, but employment surely does. And so these certainly Greece and maybe Portugal are just too far out of bounds. I wouldn't say that about Ireland. I certainly wouldn't say it about Italy, quite apart from the fact that you know, you can't kind of hold the core Eurozone together and have Italy and Spain failing. And so then the question is, does Italy have, is it going to play its part, and is the European Union going to play its part? It is the epicenter of risk right now. I think the answer in the Italian case is probably yes. I mean, when I ask myself these questions, regardless of what country it's in, if they have a challenge, I ask, do they have the resources to deal with it? Do they have the competence, which means do the people making the choices know what they're doing? And do they have the political will? Italy is actually one of the richest countries in the world in terms of per capita wealth. It is not out of line in aggregate debt. It just has high public debt. It's matched by very low debt in the household sector. If you just sit and study the balance sheet of this country, it has lots of dynamic components of the industry, so it's not short of resources. It has to dial back, as do many countries, the liabilities associated with the pension system and stuff like that. It has to get rid of rigidities in the labor market. It has to make some important structural changes, get rid of kind of monopolies, pay more taxes. Tax evasion is a big, big problem that they're sort of going after now. It's kind of fun to watch. The finance police are sort of investigating people. So then the question, and they know what they're doing. So then the question is, do we have the political will? And I would say the jury's out on that. The investors are saying we're not sure enough yet, and we're not sure you're going to be given the time because we're not sure the ECB and the Financial Stability Board will step in if you get into trouble. One thing's for sure, at Italy's level of sovereign debt in relationship to GDP, if you run the yields up to 7 to 8% and leave them there, then it completely changes the incentive structure. I mean, countries aren't normally considered insolvent, but the incentive to sort of fix things as opposed to say, to heck with this enterprise, changed pretty dramatically. So then the question is, will that support come from the center if this is a credible reform program? And I think the situation we've got is that it probably will, but they don't want to say it. And they don't want to say it because they don't want to take the pressure off the reform process. The central bank under Draghi is pouring money into the banks, which is legitimate given their mandate. A credit lockup of the type that we nearly had in 2008 would cause unbelievable amounts of damage, or a failure in the payment system. But there's a suspicion that some of that money going into the banks is flowing through to the sovereign debt market, so it may be kind of the back door, and that's okay. So there's, I think, a reasonably good chance that the core of Europe will get through this and get through it stronger. Now, the other piece of this is that Chancellor Merkel said somewhere along the line that we were going to do institutional reform and fiscal centralization as part of the process. Not the old conventional wisdom was stabilize first and do that later. And I think, I don't have any inside track into what she's thinking, but I think she thought, if we stabilize first, the incentives to fix the thing structurally will go away, so maybe we'll do them at the same time. It makes a pretty complicated set of transitions, but history may say she's right if we get through this. So, it won't be pretty. There's roles for the IMF and external financing to try to help, I think, but not out in front. This is a European enterprise. And I'm cautiously optimistic. The downside risks are pretty high, to be fair. To the point where if you spend a lot of time talking to investors, I mean, this is almost a bimodal distribution. There's two scenarios, and depending on what weights you put on each of them, you end up with something that looks like this. And I think that's probably right now. But that could resolve itself in the next year.
Does your cautious optimism, does it extend to the G20?
No, right now I would say the G20 is, except for the rather admirable performance, right in the middle of the crisis, has not really found its feet in terms of policy coordination. So I would say that's still on the to-do list. It's important because it's got arguably the major players that need to sort of have some common understanding of what's supposed to happen in the global economy. But that's a very heterogeneous group, even relative to Europe. I mean, Europe is the most important experiment, if you like, in the post-war period in sort of the creation of a supranational structure that really works. The G20 eventually probably has to, even if it's less complete, move in that direction, and it hadn't gotten very far along. I don't view that as wildly critical under the circumstances, but it's probably pretty important. I mean, a world in which basically every outcome, including in terms of policy, is a non-cooperative one doesn't sound like a very, well-governed world to me.
So finally, Michael, we're here today in a business school. IMD is committed to developing global leaders. We're trying to equip leaders, not just to manage the future, but to take a clear lead role in the future. What would be the advice that you would want to leave with viewers watching today in the business community? What should we be doing?
Well, I think it's, in many ways, it's a continuation of what's actually been happening in the business community. I mean, I think there's all kinds of reasons to be broadly knowledgeable about what's going on in the world. And I mean, at some fairly deep level, not just a kind of passing understanding that, there's a couple of big countries somewhere out there to the east, but what's going actually on in them and how they work. I think that for a business, the evolution of the awareness of these things and fundamental values with respect to the environment, with respect to lots of things, are going to be important to businesses, customers, and employees. And I think far-sighted businesses, many of them are here in Europe, frankly, are taking these things increasingly seriously and learning how to build all of that into their business model, if you like, the way they operate, the way they relate to stakeholders of all kinds, and so on. I think there's an important, untapped agenda, which is, I don't think in most of the places I've been, the business community's input to what you might call a broader social or policy or whatever agenda is as effective or as broad as it should be. And so I think it's worth working on finding ways in which that can happen without running, the obvious risks of sort of special pleading, pushing of special interests and so on. I mean, I think there's natural obstacles to that because the suspicion coming from the business side is of course that they have specific interests as well as leaders and human beings, general interests, and you sort of have to divide them up a little bit. The other thing I've come to believe is that the values are really important. This is anecdotal, but when I was a kid growing up in Canada, and I think it was true in most countries, maybe still is, but I don't think it is in Canada, we all took a course on civics. It was called different things in America, but the idea was pretty simple. You're supposed to understand how a democracy worked, and in the course of it, what your responsibilities were, how you related to other citizens, and so on. And people laughed at it and said it was Mickey Mouse, but actually it's kind of important. And there's a sense I have that these values get not so much, they don't vanish, but they get set aside a little bit too much. I mean, I don't think, for example, the financial sector is yet as intent as it should be on reestablishing its credibility in terms of being there to support, the functioning of the economy and the society. And I can't help feeling that, somewhere along the line, somebody dropped the ball. Maybe we in academia dropped the ball a bit on sort of how these things all fit together, and I think they fit together with values. The other thing is the elites, I think. Jean-Pierre said in one of his recent statements that the elites have been damaged. I think that's right. I mean, people don't trust business. They don't trust the financial sector. Frankly, they don't trust economists, for good reason. We by and large, didn't say much about the risks of the growth path we were on. And so I think we've all got a big job to reestablish our credibility and commitment to kind of broader social goals.
Michael, thanks so much for being with us today and sharing some of the content of the next Convergence. Clearly, this is something that impacts us all already today, is going to impact us increasingly. So your book gives remarkable wisdom and insight into that. So thank you for coming and sharing some of that with us today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.